Truth number 13, hedonism opens the door for pornography. Jeremy Bentham, who lived a couple hundred years ago, is considered by many to be the father of modern hedonism. Bentham promoted the philosophy that pleasure is the highest good and ultimate purpose of life, and that pain should be avoided at all cost. Interestingly, he was also a strong advocate for animal rights, the freedom of expression, the right to divorce, the abolition of punishment, including corporal discipline of children, and the decriminalization of homosexuality. In short, much of the liberal agenda of our day can be traced back to his hedonistic philosophy of living to please oneself. For the most part, the evangelical church has withstood the pressure to adopt his secondary pet philosophies about things like homosexuality or the discipline of children. But if we're honest with ourselves, we'd have to admit that when it comes to the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of suffering, there's not much difference between believers and unbelievers. The typical evangelical avoids blatant sins such as drinking and drugging, but the lust for the things of the world is just as strong in his heart as the unsaved. How else can we explain all the television we watch, the internet we surf, the social media we obsess over, the video games we play, and yes, the pornography we give ourselves to? These have all become mainstays of the modern American church. They also represent a lifestyle that's becoming increasingly self-focused, self-indulgent, and self-deceived. And what's disconcerting is that Bentham's hedonistic way of life has become more prevalent with each new generation of churchgoers. For instance, the subject of conversation in a church youth group today is more likely to revolve around Game of Thrones or the Avengers than any meaningful discussion of the things of God. And it's far more likely that selfies and Facebook postings will be shared than Bible verses. Nevertheless, it needs to be said that the love of pleasure is not a new concept. First century Epicureans advocated Bentham's philosophy long before he arrived on the scene. The Christian leaders of that time saw the hedonism of the Greek culture as a great threat to the body of Christ. Nearly every book of the New Testament contains warnings about indulging the lusts of the flesh. The Greek term they employed for lust, epithumia, often refers to sexual desires, but it can actually be used to describe one's craving for any form of pleasure forbidden by the Lord. This craving, which emerges from one's fallen nature, provides the energy that drives a person to go after the sin of his choice. While our church fathers understood this pull of worldly pleasure, they could never imagine the level of temptation we face on a daily basis in our pleasure-driven culture. The prosperity we enjoy and the technological advances of our age have put nearly any desire we can imagine within reach. Such a flesh-pleasing lifestyle can quickly get out of hand because the more a man attempts to satisfy the desire for sin, the less satisfied he becomes. In fact, the more that a person pursues sin, the more inflamed his inward lust will become. As millions have discovered, the ever-driving lust for pleasure cannot be placated. A hedonistic mindset can end up in only one place: a person who sees himself as the center of a universe filled with carnal delights. A churchgoer might be willing to incorporate a few biblical commandments into his lifestyle if he thinks it'll help him escape hell. But if that is what motivates him to be a Christian, he's only fooling himself. A secular hedonist might wonder how his attitude towards suffering is any different from that of Jeremy Bentham. There's no question that a lust-driven lifestyle will quickly hollow a person out. The more he goes to the empty cisterns of this world to seek pleasure, the emptier he becomes. Solomon's an example of someone who forfeited his walk with God for the pursuit of pleasure. At the end of his life, he would write, "I thought to myself, come now, I will try self-indulgent pleasure to see if it's worthwhile. But I found that it also is futile. I said of partying, it is folly, and of self-indulgent pleasure, it accomplishes nothing." What he discovered 3,000 years ago is certainly just as relevant to us today. I understand pleasure's emptiness from my own life experience. I spent many of my first 30 years driven by lust and living for self. My sole purpose in life was to have everything I wanted and to gratify my insatiable lust for pleasure. At the heart of hedonism is the adage, if it feels good, it must be right. For the hedonistic Christian, one's feelings determine everything. If he feels like obeying God, he obeys Him. If he doesn't feel like it, he doesn't. And if he feels like sinning, he sins. Obedience then becomes a matter of subjective convenience and choice, all revolving around how he feels at the moment. One modern writer expressed the inward conviction of the typical Christian hedonist this way: my feelings determine my choices. I accept only what makes me feel good, happy, comfortable, excited, and so on. I reject what disturbs or troubles me, or is too demanding or difficult, or threatens my personal pleasure. I also reject whatever has ceased to thrill me. I reject what is boring. Wow, did he ever nail it? If that's the underlying attitude among modern Christians, no wonder heartfelt submission to God is so rarely seen in our churches. And herein lays one of the primary reasons why Christian men have no strength to withstand sexual temptation. Since their feelings are given preeminent place in their lives, they find they don't have the spiritual wherewithal to withstand temptations when they appear. If they live by the adage, if it feels good, it must be right, in every other area of their lives, what makes them think they'll be able to say no to sexual temptation when it comes their way? One of the first things we teach the men who come to the Pure Life Ministries residential program is that they must escape this feelings-driven way of life. Until they make a resolute decision that obedience to God and submission to His will are going to establish the course of their lives, they're never going to be free of the addiction to sexual pleasure. They must learn to obey God all the time, in spite of how they feel. Only then will they have the wherewithal to deny temptation. We also help them to understand that when they return home, they can't go back to the same indulgent lifestyle they had before coming to Pure Life. It was that pleasure-seeking way of life that allowed their addiction to flourish in the first place. That lifestyle must change before the power of the addiction can be broken. As long as Christians remain committed to the great God pleasure, its various forms will be welcome and the demands of self-denial made by Jesus Christ will be rejected. But I fear many have passed the point of no return. They're addicted to pleasure and happy to have it so. For myself, I had to come to the place of rejecting the idol of pleasure and embracing the cross of Christ. The payoff for doing things God's way is an inner joy and a sense of fulfillment that doesn't need a constant stream of carnal pleasures to make me happy. Don't get me wrong. The Lord is very good to me and has blessed me in countless ways, and I would never want to go back to that old life. But I had to come to the place where pleasing Him became the great purpose of my life, whether or not I ever experienced carnal pleasure again. Once that decision was made, how could sexual pleasure keep its grip on my life?